Hi, I'm Saskia van Nahuys, and I'm a professor of ecology at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. And the lecture I'm going to do right now is part one of a two-part lecture on species invasions. So species invasions are an extremely important topic for humans. And since this is an ecology course, I'm going to be talking about it mostly with respect to ecological processes. But of course, it's a very important topic for other reasons as well. So invasive species have a huge impact on ecosystems, as you're going to see examples of in these lectures. But they also kill plants that are important to us, kill organisms that are important to us. Diseases are invasive species that affect us directly, and invasive species generally have had a huge sort of monetary or economic cost globally. But again, I'm going to be talking about the ecological issues related to invasive species here. And so this is two parts. In part one, I'm going to talk about defining invasive species and defining what the ecological impacts of invasive species are. I'm going to use an example of an extreme effect of the brown tree snake in Guam. And then I'm going to talk about sort of the first step in the process of species invasion, which is the intentional or the accidental transport of invasive species to a new place. And I'm going to present the concept of a propegule, which is the seed or tissue or organism that actually moves from the native habitat to the invasive place. And then in the second part, we're going to sort of use the tools from the first part to talk about what about a community allows it to be invaded, how biotic interactions can either facilitate or inhibit invasion, and then other aspects of the process, such as the rate of spread of invasive species and mechanisms, both ecological and evolutionary, that go into that rate of spread. And then some characteristics of species invasions which are really intriguing, such as often there's a very long lag time between when a species is introduced to a new environment until it becomes invasive, and what are the processes that could explain that long lag time. All right, so here we go. So what is an invasive species? So mostly we think of an invasive species as a non-native species that has a demonstrable negative ecological and economical impact where it has been introduced. And we also include native species that have become out of hand and sort of locally behave as invasive. And I'll give you some examples of those. And you may ask, what about all the non-native species that are introduced to a new place, but they haven't been spreading in the new habitat? Do we call those invasive species? It sort of depends on your definition of an invasive species. Some people might say that any non-native species in a different habitat is invasive, but I think it's more precise and useful to think of invasive species only as those that get to a new habitat and they spread and impact the ecosystems in the new place. So if a plant or an animal is brought into a new place and it doesn't spread, it just is there, such as in a garden, it's not considered an invasive species. An important thing to keep in mind, of course, is that even though there's a lot of invasive species globally, not all species make good invaders, and not all communities are equally invadable. All right, so I'm going to start out with an extreme example of the impact of an invasive species. And this is illustrating the idea that when an invasive species is successfully invasive, then it has a profound change on the community in the new community it inhabits. So the brown tree snake is a species of snake that is native sort of in the southern hemisphere in the tropical areas, and was then introduced onto the island of Guam. So here's the red shows the tropical areas where it's native, and then Guam is a small island that's outside of that area. And so this snake invaded into Guam in 1944 and 1945. And so if we look at the food web, of the vertebrate food web in Guam before the invasion, this is before the snake was there, what do we see? We see that there's a bunch of herbivores, such as some birds, a fruit-feeding bird, fruit-feeding bats, some other species, and even some invasive species were already present. All of the gray species are invasive species. So there's some herbivores. And then there's some insectivores, some such as more birds, skink, geckos, and then on top of that, there's some carnivores that are eating these species at the lower trophic levels, so more geckos, a monitor lizard, some birds. And then there's some top carnivores, or actually one top carnivore, which eats other carnivores as well as other species. And so this was the vertebrate food web that was present in Guam. Then, so during World War II, for a lot of World War II, Guam was sort of a military base of Japan. But then in 1944, the US took that military base from Japan and put its own military there. And so in the process of doing that, it brought airplanes and vehicles and people and all of the equipment from surrounding area that they had at military bases in surrounding areas, and they brought them to Guam. And in the process of doing that, there were brown snakes in the equipment. So, you know, in the hull of the airplane, or in the wheel wells of the vehicles, these snakes were just there. And so that's how the snake got introduced in 1944. So go ahead 20 years. And we look at what does the vertebrate food web look like now. So by 20 years, the brown tree snake was very well established. Here it is here. And all these arrows pointing to the brown tree snake show that the brown tree snake is eating all of these different species. So the brown tree snake has replaced the fairy tern, a bird, as the top predator. And it eats species at all the different other trophic levels. So you can already see that it's having a big effect on the food web. That's after 20 years. Then if we look so that was 1965, then if we look at 1996, we see the food web is drastically changed. So now the fairy tern has been out-competed by the brown tree snake, so it's the only top predator. Many of the native species, so the ones in the black in black font, have disappeared. They're no longer present in Guam. And what exists, and many of the species that exist that persist, are invasive species such as rats and mice. So due to the brown tree snake, there's fewer species, there's a simpler food web, and that food web is made mostly of invasive species. So this is sort of a classic example of the way in which a very invasive species has an effect not on species throughout the community and the ecosystem. Okay. So, and there are many examples of this. This is not a particularly surprising one. All right. So we think of invasion as a multi-step process. The organisms are made of someplace, one way or another, through human-aided ways. They get to a new place. They have to establish there. Their population has to grow. Then they have to spread, dispersal. And then they have some impact. And after a while, it's an impact that we humans notice. So I'm going to talk about this first part now, native someplace else and the transport. So here's some words or sort of concepts that we need to have in mind. So organisms that are invasive could be plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, virus, basically everything that's alive is invasive. The second term is propegule, and that's a sort of an awkward term, which is the set of individuals released into the non-native environment. So it's the arriving individuals, that's called the propegule. Transport is the way that it gets there. So remember that in order for something to be invasive, it has to it has to be human aided in the way that it gets there. And so the transport can be could be by boat or by train or by just in humans' pockets, like lots of different ways. And finally, there's the path that it takes to get there. So is it going over the ocean? Is it going over roads? You know, how does it actually get to the new environment? Okay. So many invasive species that we now consider invasive were actually introduced to the new environment intentionally. And usually that's associated with commerce or something related to that. So that includes cultivated plants, farmed animals, aquaculture. So these are things that people bring along. Say often colonists bring them into countries when they go there in order to have the things that they want. Another often invasive plant in this case are biofuel plants. And so this jatropha is a good example of a biofuel plant. So it was introduced as a biofuel because it grows very easily, doesn't need much resources, doesn't take a lot of water, so that makes a good biofuel. It's cheap. But then those are also features of invasive plants. And so pretty much all of the places where this biofuel has been introduced to, this plant has been introduced to use as a biofuel, it has also become invasive, including in India. Bait fish. So people, when they want to, people may be fishing for native or invasive fish, but they bring in other fish to use as bait, and then those fish become invasive. People bring in animals for hunting. So deer have been brought between continents for hunting, ducks, wild boar. All of these things are invasive because they were intentionally introduced. A strange kind of human activity, which is called acclimatization societies, and I'll have a couple of examples of that later, where people kind of as a sport introduced species to new habitats. People who, when plants are brought in as ornamental plants and then they escape and become invasive. Similarly, when pets, pets and aquarium fish are brought in and then they're released into the environment and they become invasive. And then other things which seem like they shouldn't be sources of invasive species but actually are, such as arboretums. So these days, arboretums, which are sort of like museums for live plants, are monitored pretty closely, but not in the past they haven't been, and so plants have been brought in into arboretums, and then they have escaped the arboretum and become invasive. And then finally, organisms are brought into the new location for biological control. And that means that you bring one organism to control, in order to control another organism. That other organism probably also was invasive itself. So we'll have an example of that. Okay, so this is an example of an intentional introduction. So the spongy moth was introduced from Europe into the US in 1896 as potentially a moth to use for making silk, although it doesn't make very good silk. So it was brought in, and then it escaped, and then it became an invasive species in the northeastern forests in North America, and it has a huge effect on all deciduous trees in the forest. And so after a while, starting in 1906, people started introducing natural enemies of the gypsy moth. So this is predators and parasites of the gypsy moth in order to have those hopefully control the gypsy moth. They introduced maybe 30 different species, but one of the species they introduced was this parasitoid fly. So this is a fly that is parasitic of the gypsy moth, Compsylura. And so they introduced this, and it was also from Europe, just like the gypsy moth, which kind of makes sense. So they knew it used the gypsy moth, but they didn't know that it also used many, many native moth species in North America. And so they introduced this fly. It uses over 200 moth species in the forest of North America, and actually doesn't really use the gypsy moth very much. So it definitely has not contributed to controlling the gypsy moth, but it's had a profound impact on the native moths in the North American deciduous forest. And this is a picture of Cecropia, which is a very large, beautiful moth, which is one of them that's threatened by the Compsognathus fly. Okay, so that was a bunch of intentional introductions, but invasive species also arrive by unintentional means. And so these are usually related to some kind of transport, so they come along with something else. So they can be attached to vehicles, such as on ships or in the ship ballast water. So this is water that's put in ships in order to make it heavier, make it less buoyant when it's not full, and that ballast water has organisms in it. It can be in the wheel wells of vehicles, of trains. It can be packed along with cargo. It can be part of the cargo, so those kinds of unintentional ways. It can also come, invasive species also arrive with other organisms. So parasites, ticks, mites, other kinds of parasites arrive with their hosts. Insects arrive on plants. Pathogens arrive on plants and with other animals. And plants, when forage for livestock are moved between countries, many times there's seeds of invasive plants that are in that forage. Okay. And then there's other ways that species become invasive that are a little bit more complicated. So one way is that a species arrived and it wasn't invasive, and then it evolves and it changes in some way and then becomes invasive. And maybe an example of that is COVID-19, which switched hosts. Another way that things become invasive is they're there but not invasive, and then an ecosystem changes and becomes invasible, and then the invasive species moves in. Or a species that is actually native can become invasive because of the changes in the environment. And so an example of that is the white-tailed deer, again in eastern North America, which has become invasive in the sense that it disrupts the ecosystem, both because of loss of predators, wolves. There's many fewer wolves than there used to be, but also because of increase of the sort of grassland habitat that they really like, and forest, or open forest. And so they have become invasive even though they're native. Okay. All right. So that's how species get to their new environment. And one thing to keep in mind when you think about that transport, I guess there's two things to keep in mind. One thing to keep in mind is lots of things get transported sort of all the time. Things are kind of transport vehicles and things like that are contaminated with things. That's pretty much always true. And only some of those become invasive. So not everything that arrives in a place becomes an invasive. And so one of the reasons that it doesn't become invasive is because it's not really suited to that environment, or it's not very competitive, or things like that. But another reason that it doesn't become invasive is because there's some kinds of controls, sort of human controls of the ports of entry. So for example, where ships, so a shipping yard, or a place where, a large port where many ships come with a lot of cargo, there's some monitoring for invasive species. And so some invasive species are stopped, or the process is slowed down because of human sort of intervention at ports of entry. And so not all species are naturally invasive, and some invasive species are still stopped. There may be some quarantine, something like that. Okay. So there's the transport. The thing that gets transported, again, is the propegule. And the size of the propegule is the number of individuals that arrive to a new environment. So you can imagine that, say, we move some livestock forage from one country to another country. It's not just going to have one seed of an invasive species. It might have 100 seeds, or 5,000 seeds, or some number of seeds, and that's the size of the propegule. And a concept that people who study invasion ecology think about is propegule pressure. And so propegule pressure is sort of like the force by which potential invaders arrive in an environment. And so you can think of that pressure as due to both the frequency of propagules arriving, they arrive over and over again from the same environment or from different environments, and also the size of those propagules. Is it a lot of seeds? Is it a few seeds? Is it a lot of individuals? And so that's the propagule pressure. It's sort of a conglomerate of size of the propagules and frequency of the propagules. And like if a potentially invaded environment receives a propagule, it's likely that it's going to receive other propagules later, or has already received propagules via the same routes. And so ecologists studying invasion, especially say if they're modeling invasion or trying to predict the severity of a particular potentially invasive species, think quite a lot about propagule pressure. Because, for example, if you'd like to sort of decide how much effort to putting into slowing down or evading the process of evasion, then you would like to know, well, how big a risk is it to the environment? And one component of the risk is like how frequently is it coming into the environment? And so, there's kind of an intuitive way that people think about this, which is that the probability of becoming established in the environment depends on the propagule pressure. And so this is just a schematic representation of this. So the probability of establishment in a new environment increases with the propagule pressure. And that pressure is both the size of the propagules and the frequency of the propagules. And you can look in nature at various different sort of both real examples and models based on real examples, and see sort of two different kinds of patterns. One of them is that that there's some kind of a threshold, meaning the probability of establishment increases with propagule pressure up to a certain point, and then it kind of levels off, meaning the more and more come, the probability of establishment sort of stays the same. Versus a situation in which a more simple situation in which the propagule pressure, the probability of establishment just keeps increasing with the propagule pressure. And not shown on this graph or this figure is the situation in which propagules arrive but they don't establish. And we're going to talk later about what are situations in which the natural environment resists establishment of propagules. Okay, so the propagule pressure itself depends on various things. So one of the things it depends on is the abundance of the species in the donor location. So if something is extremely common where it originates from, then it will have high propagule pressure. But if it's a rare thing, it may come very infrequently, simply because of the abundance at its origin. Another thing that affects the propagule pressure is the frequency of the vector. And so you could think, so the vector might be ship hulls, or it might be cargo containers, or it might be in the pet trade, maybe the value of that organism as a pet, as an exotic pet. If it's very valuable, people will try to bring it in a lot of time in order to make some money. And so the frequency of the vector will, of course, affect the propagule pressure. The other thing is the survival of the propagule during transport. So if, some cargo ships take many months to get, across the ocean, or they may stop at many different ports, and it could be that the propagule dies along the way. But if it's a very robust, sturdy propagule, like say some seeds, and some microorganisms, then it would last for a really long time in transport. And so the sort of the survival rate of the propagule affects the propagule pressure. And that's sort of related to the lengths of the trips. How far away is the new environment from the old environment? How accessible is it? That kind of thing. And then, as I mentioned before, propagule pressure is affected by interception at the port of entry. So some things just arrive freely with no interception. And for some things, there's a lot of quarantine. There might be fumigation. Many times, Cargo on ships from some areas may be fumigated. So, for example, sometimes, cargo, especially if it involves food, coming from one country into another country may be fumigated before it's released, and that's reducing the propagule pressure of some potential invasive species at the port of entry. Okay. So this is an example, so what I said to you was just all words, and there's actually many, many examples where we look at, where these, There's some examples where we see the effects of these different factors on propagule pressure, and I'm going to give you one example. And so this is birds introduced from Europe into New Zealand in 1900. So I mentioned these things which are called acclimatization societies, and this is something, in like 1880 to 1910, colonists, mostly Europeans, who went to live in different countries, had as a sport trying to establish species from their homeland in their new land. And so it's kind of a sport just to see what can you bring in and get established. And it's also kind of a way to try to feel more comfortable, to have familiar organisms around you. And so people brought on ships, especially both plants and animals, as parts of these sort of acclimatization clubs. Okay, so this is showing, on this figure what we see is the number of different bird species and the number of release attempts into New Zealand. And so black is when it was successfully, the bird species was successfully established in New Zealand, and white is when they brought it, but it did not successfully establish ever. So for example, many bird species they only tried to release it one time and it did not establish. That's this big bar at like about 36 different bird species where they tried it one time and it didn't work. Although you notice that 4 bird species, they tried it one time and it did work. But as you move on, you see more and more black. So for example, the species, all of the species that they attempted 16 different times, so 16 different boat trips to New Zealand, 16 times, 15 different species were established. So that means these ones, they kept trying and trying, and eventually they did establish. And so that means that as they increased the propagule pressure, the probability of establishment definitely increased. Another reason, another reason that, so I gave you the example that propagule pressure really does increase the rate of establishment, and the reasons for this. One is that just sort of chance. The more you try, eventually you get one that works. So that's just chance. Another one is the more you try, the more likely it is that you happen to, by chance, bring in some really high fitness individuals. And you bring in some really high fitness, say there's variation in fitness in the original population, the more you try, the more representation of that population you'll get, and you'll get some really good ones. The other reason is that many species need other species in order to establish. Or no, actually, first, many species need other individuals in order to establish. So for example, social species need a whole group of them. So it may not be able to spread until there's a larger population. And then also, it may be that as you're introducing species, you say introduce the species that they're dependent on, such as their pollinator. And so if you keep on introducing more and more things, you might end up also introducing their pollinators. You introduce larger groups so that they can have social interactions they need, and then they're able to become invasive. So that's all I'm going to get to in this section, but I'm just going to sort of go over the key parts really quickly. So we call a species that's spreading in a new environment invasive if that spread is caused by something that humans are doing. So if you look sort of over geological time, of course, species change in their ranges and stuff. And this species invasion is a different process than that. Species invasion involves humans. It has an ecological and an economic impact. I gave you an example where the brown tree snake had an effect on the whole vertebrate forest food web. We talked about the first step in the process of invasion, which is the invasive species, the potentially invasive species getting to the new place as a propegule. And then we talked about the idea of propegule pressure and what affects the propegule pressure. Okay. And so in this next section, we're going to use some of the key concepts that I brought up in this to talk about species invasions, and especially things about the receiving environment that make it susceptible to invasion. All right, so that was all for Species Invasions Part 1, and I'll see you next time for Species Invasion Part 2.